On April 15, 1936, about a month after the commissioning of Tarpon, and only days following the launching of Perch, the U.S. began construction of its next class of submarine. These were the 6 boats of the 1,435 surfaced, 2,198 submerged ton Salmon class, and the 10 boats of the 1,450 surfaced, 2,350 submerged ton Sargo class. Good boats as the porpoises were, the U.S. wanted better. A major, if not obvious, change was the adoption of 2 more rear torpedo tubes. This was an example of the technology causing a rethinking of tactics. Historically, a sub would find its target, move into firing position, fire while closing, and then launch a second spread with its rear tubes while moving away. If it was safe, the sub could then come around to start the process all over again. In theory, the TDC, along with longer-ranged, gyro-controlled torpedoes, could change this. The TDC could track targets and develop increasingly improving fire control solutions even at long ranges, high angles, and while both the sub and the target ship were maneuvering. Once fired, the gyroscopes in the torpedo allowed it to turn better than 90 degrees off axis to potentially even attack ships sailing parallel to the sub. Combined with higher speeds and a new 40-foot periscope debuting in Snapper, a new attack strategy evolved. Now a submerged boat could sail across and in front of a target's path, firing its rear tubes as the target passed behind it. It could then do a U-turn and re-attack with its forward tubes. It could then do another U-turn and continue firing with its reloaded rear tubes. This pattern could continue until the sub had to break off the attack for whatever reason. Using this idea, rear tubes were now as important, or even more so, than forward ones, since they would be firing the first volley. As a result, the number of tubes forward and aft were balanced. In theory, this sounds great, but for a variety of reasons it was rarely practiced, and post-war, rear tubes fell out of favor. The largest change was again propulsion. The all-electric drive of the Porpoise class had been a technical revolution. However, it was not without its drawbacks. It was relatively heavy, bulky, and expensive. It also lost an estimated 360 horsepower in the electrical transmission from the engines to the motors. To help reduce these, a hybrid method or composite drive was adopted. In this composite drive, the 2 forward engines still drove the motors in an electric fashion, but the 2 rear engines drove the propellers in a traditional direct drive manner. Mechanically, this ultimately proved more trouble than it was worth, and the final 4 reverted to all-electric drive. All future non-nuclear subs would be electric drive, so I won't bother rehashing it from here on. Another change was fuel capacity. Well, it should go without saying that even as the size of subs grew, their fuel capacity grew, sometimes by storing fuel in the ballast tanks. Rarely was this growth as dramatic as in the change from the Salmons to the Sargos. Whereas the Salmons maxed at about 125 tons of fuel, 13 more than the Perches, the Sargos better than doubled this to about 300 tons. Similarly, battery capacity increased. The 2 groups of 120-cell batteries used since Argonaut were replaced in the Sargos by 2 groups of more powerful 126-cell batteries that would continue to be used from here on in new subs throughout the war, with the exception of the mackerels. This increased sustained diving times as they went from 6,200 amp-hour per group in the Salmons to 8,100 amp-hour in the Sargos. This also increased battery life as the batteries had to be recharged less often. These new batteries would often be referred to as Sargo batteries. Though an obvious improvement, these boats were not without their problems. Notably, the first 6 Sargos were overweight. The Navy built Sculpin and Squalus, originally being dangerously so. The other major problem was, again, the engines. With the exception of the last one, Sea Lion, All of the Salmons and Sargos built by electric boat used HOR engines, the notorious whores. The 6 Salmons were built between April 15, 1936 and June 30, 1938. Salmon, Seal, and Skipjack were built by electric boat. Snapper, Stingray, and Sturgeon were built by the Navy. The 10 Sargos were built between May 12, 1937 and December 1, 1939. Sargo, Surrey, Spearfish, Sea Dragon, and Sea Lion were built by electric boat. The Navy built Sculpin, Squalus, Swordfish, Sea Raven, and Sea Wolf. Main armament was 8 torpedo tubes, 4 forward and 4 aft. 2 reloads for each of the forward tubes and 1 for each of the rear tubes was carried internally. An additional reload for each of the rear tubes was carried externally under the main deck, which brought total torpedo loadout to 24. A single 3-inch 50 caliber gun was originally fitted behind the sail. Main propulsion was provided by 4 GM or HOR diesel engines. These generated 6,140 horsepower for a surface speed of about 21 knots. As noted, 2 engines were clutched to the shafts in a direct drive manner, while the other 2 worked in an electric drive fashion for the Salmons and the first 6 Sargos. The last 4 Sargos, sometimes called the Sea Dragons, reverted to all-electric drive. 2 auxiliary diesels were also fitted that generated a combined 1,000 horsepower in an electric drive manner. While submerged, they used the batteries to power the 4 electric motors, which produced 2,740 horsepower for a speed of 8 3/4 knots. Sustained underwater endurance was again 10 hours at 5 knots, but grew to 48 hours at 2 knots thanks to the new batteries. Test diving depth was again 250 feet. As with most subs, these boats were modified as a result of lessons learned during the war. Stingray was fitted with 2 external tubes in October 1942, like the porpoises. Being of little value, they were removed in 1943. Throughout 1943 and 1944, the surviving boats originally fitted with the HORs had them replaced with GM engines. Also, the number of holes in the top of the ballast tanks was increased, especially in the Navy-built boats. This allowed air to escape quicker and thus allowed the boat to dive faster. It should of course go without saying that like most ships and subs, their electronics, radar for example, was constantly upgraded between patrols. An important but often overlooked example of this is the fitting and constant upgrading of radio direction finding equipment. Like most of the porpoises and some of the S-class, all of the Salmons and Sargos were based in the Philippines on December 7, 1941. Following the initial shock of Japan's attack, they quickly began hunting for targets in the waters around the Philippines and the East Indies. At one point or another, many unloaded most of their torpedoes and ran supplies to the beleaguered garrison defending Corregidor. After the fall of the East Indies and the Philippines, they mostly operated from Australia. From there, they mostly spent the rest of 1942 continuing to hunt the shipping routes between the East Indies and Japan, with some shifting to the northern Solomons once the fighting around Guadalcanal started in late 1942. At the start of 1943, all returned to the west coast for overhaul. Rested, repaired, resupplied, and refitted by mid-1943, the first 3 Salmons headed north, where they operated from the Aleutians to Hokkaido before rejoining their sisters already operating in the Central Pacific and along the sea lanes from Japan to the East Indies. By the start of 1945, huge numbers of newer and better boats, along with a decreasing target pool, made them superfluous, and they were relegated to training for the rest of the war. While no Salmons were lost during the war, 4, arguably 5, Sargos weren't as lucky. Squalus sunk May 23, 1939, during diving trials due to the main induction valves failing to properly seal the air intakes to her engines. 26 men, including 2 civilian contractors, perished as the boat hit bottom in 243 feet of water. The first sub on the scene was Squalus' sister, Sculpin. Eventually, the remaining 33 crew members, including the other civilian contractor, were rescued using the McCann Rescue Diving Bell, which had been developed following the numerous S-class accidents which had shown the need to be able to rescue the crews of sunken subs. Raised, repaired, and renamed Sailfish, she was recommissioned a year later, May 15, 1940. Sea Lion was caught in port at the Philippines during an air raid December 10, 1941. Hit by 2 bombs and unrepairable, she was scuttled to prevent being captured. Sculpin was scuttled November 19, 1943, after being damaged when trying to get in position to attack a convoy near Truk. Only post-war did the full tale of her loss come out, a tale I would be remiss to not tell. Already having tried to attack the convoy once, she surfaced to try to get in position for another attack, only to find a destroyer waiting for her. Diving to escape, she was racked by depth charges which damaged, among other things, her sonar and depth control. Now unable to safely stay submerged, she again surfaced. Still under fire, the abandoned ship was given. One person, though, chose not to go. On board was the submarine division's commander, Captain John Cromwell. Afraid he might reveal submarine movements, plans for the upcoming invasion of Tarawa, or most importantly, information about ultra-cryptanalysis under torture, he chose to go down with the boat. Sure enough, the 41 survivors were taken to Truk before being divided up and put on 2 ships bound for Japan. One of these ships, the escort carrier Chuyo, was no stranger to carrying POWs. On December 4, 1943, while near Hachijojima, she was hit by 4 torpedoes which sank her. With her went 20 of the 21 survivors from Sculpin that were on board. The irony here was that the attacking sub was none other than Sculpin's sister, Sailfish, the former Squalus. Seawolf was apparently sunk by a friendly destroyer escort October 3, 1944, near Morotai in a blue-on-blue engagement. Swordfish was apparently sunk January 12, 1945, off Okinawa when she sailed into a minefield.